Hi everyone and welcome to an all new episode of Team Pumpkin presents Human Behind the Marketer, created by Punctuate. Today's episode is a little bit for everyone. A little bit for marketers, a little bit for working women, a little bit for runners, and even a little bit for journalists. Tara Kapur of Duolingo English Test started off her career as a television journalist, but since then has tried her hands on various facets of marketing. In spite of having a full-time career, not only Tara managed to get an executive degree from IIM Calcutta, but is also an avid runner. In this episode, we hope to find her secret to creating the right balance. So, feel free to eavesdrop. Thank you for being a part of Human Behind the Marketer. Tara, it's been a genuine pleasure having you with us today.
Really happy to be here.
Thank you. And I have to say, I love your house. Not just the view, the way you guys have set it up.
Thank you. Yeah, it's. I love doing this. I love sort of spending some time and just adding bits and pieces. So it's something I've enjoyed. Thank you.
You know, there's a little anecdote I'd like to share with you, and I've been actually looking forward to telling you that since we arrived, but then I wanted your reaction on camera, so I waited. So you used to work with ET now, right?
Yes, I did.
Right. And now I'm pretty sure you will not remember this because it was like a million years ago. But I used to intern at ET now when you were working over there.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so
That's amazing.
I used to report to Faye D'Souza and Jatin
Oh,
Tulsiani.
yes, of course. So, it was crazy because I recently went to the FEs for the award celebration and all of that. And I bumped into this whole group of, the journalists that were covering ADMA at that time. And, it was just such a good catch up and similar kind of story because one of my interns is now, a senior editor at that point, and it was so good to see her and catch up as well. But I think ET just had that constant flow of people coming in, but that's amazing.
To begin with, Tara, you have an amazing educational background, and you've also recently done your degree with IIM Calcutta.
Mm-hmm.
So first I would want to know your educational journey because it's been pretty rich.
Mm-hmm.
So how did it all work out? How did it all start for you?
Yeah, I think for both me and my sister, our parents really prioritized education. It was important, and I think they really invested, such a large part of their earnings and salary to make sure that we just got the best education, and it was really, really important to them. And when I was young, and this is something a lot of people don't know, I actually changed 7 schools before I turned 12 years old. And that was because my parents were my dad was getting transferred. He used to work at a bank at that point, and sort of moved around and never really found my footing in that early stage because when you're young and you're moving schools, it's difficult. At one point when we moved to Delhi, my parents decided to put me in boarding school, and that was a really pivotal moment for me in my life, right? So I was there for 7 years, and that became a stable space where I think it really set the foundations for a lot of who I am today. And when I look back, it's hindsight's 2020, right? So you sort of realize what those stepping stones were. And I think it set the path for where I am in my career. It set a lot of things that matter to me personally as well, right? So it was in Landour, really beautiful scenic place. And I think that's where a lot of my attachment towards nature and being outdoors really comes from. I was the editor of my school paper and yearbook, and that set the foundations of, journalism and then moving to marketing. And I think, we can talk about that a little more later. And then the third part was running, right? I'm a passionate runner. And that again started for me in school. I used to run cross country when I was in school. I was competitive in, track and field and things like that. So school kind of built that. I've always been really independent. So when I started my career, I moved to Bombay, been here ever since. And again, that independence came from living in boarding school, making friends. And a lot of my friendships from there are still going strong. They're all over the world, but I get to catch up with them wherever I go. And it's like, it's such tight friendship that we stay in each other's houses, you're bonded. And a lot of that came from school, so it's a lot more than just education itself. It sort of set the base for everything in life. And then post that, I think the part where experience comes into play is just knowing what else is out there, right? So because I was the editor of my paper, I assumed journalism was what I wanted to do. And from there, moved and did an English literature major, and then moved to journalism school. So it just felt like that was the correct transition for me. And then years later, which is last year, I decided to go back to school because I've never had a formal education in marketing. And I felt like I wanted a course that was slightly foundational in terms of building a little more structure to how I approach marketing, how I approach management leadership. And I did a one-year degree with IIM Calcutta, which was a management and leadership course. So enjoyed going back to school, but very hard juggling work and education. But it was great.
So yeah, actually, that is my follow-up question. How did you manage to do that, right? Because it's a full-time career, full-time degree.
Yeah, it was hard. I'm not gonna lie. It was a big time suck. But I had to let other things go on the back burner, right? So there's one of my favorite quotes that really resonates with me just in life, right? And it was, "You can have everything, but not at the same time," right? And I think that, earlier at one point I used to keep saying you can't have everything, right? But I liked the spin on it, which was you can have everything, but just not at the same time. And that's pretty much what it was. It was, when I was doing the degree, my running took a back seat. So, I just couldn't manage running marathons and training and doing my degree and doing my job. So that took a back seat for a couple of years. And now that my degree is over, I'm trying to get it to come back. And that's the beautiful part, is that things can come in and out. And I think balancing that is how things tend to work. So I feel like people put pressure trying to achieve everything in one go. And that's half the reason people are unable to get, resolutions out, because they make so many. And they think that they can do it all in 1 year. And I think that's the challenge, right? Like, you need to be able to prioritize what you're going to do at which period. And life is a marathon, right? So you need to think of it from a long-term perspective and not that sprint that everyone's running after. So running's kind of a metaphor in my life as well, as you can see. But that's kind of the way I try to balance degree and work, if that answers your question.
Like you said, you started off as a journalist, right? And then you pivoted into something else. And a lot of people, including myself, we've done that pivot where we've gone from journalism to the other side. It could be comms, it could be marketing. And it can be a slightly hard thing to do, right? Because as a journalist, you're conditioned to look at things in a way. There's a lot of editorial integrity. There's a lot of things at stake, for that matter. And then there's a lot of unlearning when you go to the other side of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. So how was that transition for you?
Great question. And I think for me, it's slightly different, right? Because I wasn't a hardcore current news journalist. I was a business journalist, and the beat I used to cover was marketing and advertising, right? So more than looking at it as journalism, I looked at it as education. For me, working on a show like Brand Equity was my crash course in marketing and advertising, because it wasn't necessarily, like the part of what you're talking about, editorial integrity and putting out the story and all of that is one part of journalism. But the other part is really getting exposure, right? And what I managed to do with journalism was meet everyone in the ADMA industry and ask them questions. And like you're saying, the part that was the beauty of being a journalist is you could ask them the really hard questions, and really like push them to give you what went right and wrong. And for me, that built my ability to craft campaigns.
And what do you think of journalism in this day and age? Like, back when you were into it, or even back when I first entered into journalism, which was like around 10, 11 years ago, mm-hmm. The fundamentals have changed quite a lot, even within advertising reporting, right? Like back then, I don't know how to put it diplomatically, but back then when I started out, we did not have a lot of restrictions. We could ask what we wanted to ask, and mm-hmm. we could try, like you said, we could ask the hard questions. But time that has sort of become more and more difficult, as the industry becomes more close-knit and more regulations come into place. So what is your view on the current state of journalism?
I think there's parts of what you're talking about. There's also parts where the platforms have changed so dramatically, right? So suddenly there's so many touch points for journalism to exist, right? So you have the independents, you have breakaway journalists, like we were talking about Faye, and sort of what she's doing independently as well. And I think you have the sources depending on what you sort of want to consume. The challenge today is that everyone operates in their own silos, right? So you get to follow and consume content the way you want to. People aren't subscribing to the newspaper the way it was, and it wasn't like read every story and read the paper back to back. You choose to consume what you want to. And I think that's the risk, right? Because people start living in their little silo of consuming only content that they want to consume. And I think that's the larger challenge, right? And obviously, the media industry struggled because of just funding and making money. And, we've seen so many platforms shut down over the last decade or so. And I think that's the core challenge, right? So the unfortunate part for a lot of publications is they need to monetize in different ways. And that does challenge integrity in some shape or form. But you do see some great journalists out there. And when you look at coverage across the world, I mean, the kind of things that journalists are doing, they're risking their lives, and that integrity still remains.
Moving on to my final question for this segment, and it's a bit controversial to start with. Which do you like more, Mumbai or Delhi?
Oh, easy one, Mumbai, hands down. So for me, I mean, I moved here at the start of my career, and this is the longest stint I've spent in any place in my life. I've been here 15 years. I haven't moved, and for me, it's home. So it's not about the city per se, but it's kind of what is home to you, and I really feel Bombay's become that space for me.
Growing up, what kind of, I wouldn't call it like background, but were there any instances or any experiences that sort of have also molded you professionally in the way you make choices, in the way you take risks, things like that?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that come to mind for me. One is deeply personal and one is professional. I think for me, there was one moment when I was a journalist where I suddenly had this real itch to be on the other side of the table. And, it's ironic that we're sitting and having this conversation because that's kind of what it is, right? And I think at that point, I knew I was really in the space, but I wanted to sort of build the creative instead of talking about it. And that, that poke in my brain was sort of what was pushing me to get to where I am today. And it wasn't like a straightforward path, right? So from journalism, I then applied for at least 50 jobs, I'm not exaggerating that, at agencies, at different brands, at startups, across the board. And everybody said no, right? Because they're like, you've been a journalist for 6 years. What are you going to do in advertising and marketing? But it took that one agency, and it was a company a friend of mine was setting up, to take that punt on me. And it's based on your relationship. And, they trusted my ability. They knew my skill sets. And that 4-year period, and it was at Supari Studios, that kind of set the foundation for me. And that built the proof of concept that I can create campaigns, because that's where I sort of created this portfolio of work that, ultimately has done pretty well over time and helped me get to where I am. But I think it took that poke in my brain just saying, push yourself and it's okay, you can deal with that rejection and move forward. And a little bit of that itch comes from the personal story that I wanted to share with you. And for me, I told you, running is a metaphor in my life. And I was running a race in school. And I remember this very clearly, it was 800 meters. It was the race I used to do super well in. I was set to win this race. Like, I was the favorite to win that race. And we started the first lap, and somebody crossed me on the wrong side, and I tripped, and I just fell across this track. And, both my knees were ripped up and bloody. And, I was just seeing everyone just keep running across this track. And I was like, 1 second, this was my race, right? But what happened was I got up and I decided to continue running. And I think that determination that sort of came into play really pushed me forward, because as I ran, I just kept catching everybody. And suddenly, by the end of the race, I came second, and that second to me was so much more valuable than winning that race, because I can't tell you what that feeling was, because everyone started rooting for me, so the school kind of sits around and I could just hear my voice, my name sort of resonating, because people were suddenly like, where did she come from, and how has she gotten back to this point? And I think a little bit of that grit and determination is sort of what set the foundation for me in whatever I do in life, right? Like, you will fall down, but just pick yourself up and keep going. And I need to keep reminding myself of that. And this moment, this period of this one race comes back as that memory, saying, if you pick yourself up and you actually push yourself, you don't know what you can achieve. Like, I'm sure if there was one more lap, I would have won that race, So it was kind of that period where I like to remind myself of this. So when I was going through that period of rejection, I knew there would be that point where it would flip. And there are also a lot of people who would have given up at application number 45, right? Like, after a point, it's like, hey, what are you trying to do here, But I think that push is something that came from me running that race, and I think that's kind of built a foundation for me in my life.
That's actually a very good memory to have, and I agree. And I think Joe Rogan said in one of his podcasts that he's someone who's dealt with a lot of anxiety and all, and I remember him saying that I push myself physically so that mentally I cannot remember my anxieties. It's like when you add that one more plate and when you're squatting,
Yep.
you don't remember what you're worrying
Yep.
about. It's just about pushing yourself physically. So it kind of makes sense.
Yep.
Ties it all together. Perfect. I think that's a great note to end the first segment. So this is the next segment of the show, and it is called Keeping It Real. I think ever since advertising became more bigger and it's expanded, there have been a lot of debates. But post-COVID, there have been certain very specific debates. Right? There's been work-life balance. There's been compensation. Moonlighting, right? Remote versus office. And now I think there's something new come up called coffee badging, where apparently you go with your coffee and you socialize, and then you quickly slip away and then go somewhere else and work in peace.
Oh,
Because
really?
yeah, and I think this is for people like me who just need a reason to buy coffee. But yeah, so apparently this has been happening in agencies and all, right? But in your opinion, as someone who's been into marketing and advertising for a while now, what do you think is the biggest debate?
So I'm going to give you some pros and cons.
Yeah.
From a pro perspective, I think advertising professionals are starting to become quite valuable in the sense that marketing's diversified a lot, right? So you're seeing very different kind of profiles open up for marketers, right? So whether it's OTT companies looking for content marketers, or even the startup ecosystem is starting to look at advertising professionals as potential marketing hires, and I think that's created a lot of opportunity, which I think is great. The downside is, I think, salary. I think the fee structure and the disparity between agencies, between marketing and advertising is massive. And I think there needs to be more transparency there, right? So you're seeing a lot of companies shift and actually post salaries when they put a job listing out. And I think that's important, because it doesn't matter what somebody's making before they join. It matters how much you're willing to pay for that role and for that experience. So if somebody hits that experience set, why do you need to negotiate on them being on a low salary, right? There's an opportunity to bring somebody up, and if you have the budget for it, why not, right? So I think that's the part that needs to change. And some companies do that, but not enough do it, So I feel like that's the part that needs to evolve a little faster. And it's across the board. It's not necessarily specific to advertising, but I think that's something that needs to definitely shift, because that struggle, and we've lived it, we were journalists and we went through that struggle, it's real and it's hard, and it's very difficult in cities like Bombay, which are super expensive. So many people have moved here, they're renting, rents are exorbitant, so I think that ability to pay your people better, especially if your company has the funding for it, please do that. And I think that's the pro and con, I think, in the space right now.
So apparently now there is a phenomenon called 4 a.m. manager. And a lot of agencies are grooming more and more people into that kind of a role, so that basically that person is available to the client 24/7. And while we would all want to live in an ideal world where people are not sending briefs after 6 and we are able to wrap up on time, but with the clutter and the competition on the agency side, I think it is not possible. So, do you think something like maybe overtime, pay for overtime, or maybe people working in shifts, or some other practical solutions could be the answer to these kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard of this term before, but I think the shift angle makes sense, especially for agencies, especially for local agencies that are competing with global agencies, right? So, and that's again the exciting part is that Indian agencies are becoming competitive in global pitches, and in that process, I think what they've been losing out on is not having offices all over, and when that happens you lose out because they don't have that follow the sun model that a lot of larger global agencies have, right? So I think creating those shifts to be able to win bigger accounts makes sense. And there are enough people that would enjoy that. There are enough people who like to work the night shift. So many edits happen in the night anyway. Half the agencies wake up post noon, so sometimes you're trying to chase your agencies to be like, hey guys, it's 9 a.m. Somebody respond to me, and you'll get your response at 12 noon. And I think everyone kind of adjusts to those things. And if you're able to manage a shift model, that actually could be a way of creating a competitive advantage. So I'm all for something like that. And payment-wise, I don't know how necessarily it works, because I think the overtime concept is really hard to follow in India because everyone's working overtime, so it's a little difficult to build that out. I think creating cultures for work-life balance is important. Instead of encouraging people to work really long shifts, do the shift. We should do that in the journalism days as well. And I think it works and it's effective. But just make sure you're finding the right people and you're not putting somebody who's a morning person on your night shift. I mean, that wouldn't make sense, but yeah.
The next question is more from women at work point of view, right? And like even you must have noticed that back, if you see a decade ago, the conversations were more about boardroom representation, shattering the glass ceiling, and all of that. And touchwood, we've seen some progress, I think, where the conversation has evolved now more to a practical point of view. I think the conversation has also evolved in a manner where in their personal life, women face a lot more microaggressions, right? So after a certain age, you're expected to start a family, you're expected to have certain focuses and priorities, which might not be the case for everyone, right? So in your opinion, what are the major struggles, practical struggles that working women are facing these days?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is what you touched on it already, right? It's about finding balance. And I think that's the hardest struggle for women, because even if husbands are sharing the load, which, like you said, touchwood, a lot of them are starting to do, and you're sort of seeing a lot more balance come into relationships, especially because women are now sharing the load financially. But there's that whole angle of mental pressure and mental stress, right? Because ultimately the planning falls on the woman in a lot of shapes and forms, and whether it's meals or whether it's, what's happening next, or all of those kind of factors, there is that added load that comes on the woman, even when it comes to motherhood, right? Like, even if a husband is helping out, there's a lot of pressure that is happening to the woman just because you've carried the child, and, you're going through your own hormonal stresses and changes, and all of that is happening, which are added things which people don't talk enough about, right? But I think, again, that's where you can have everything not all at once comes into play, because sometimes you do need to take a bit of a back seat, but companies need to accommodate for that. And I think that is not happening enough yet, right? Like you said, there are positive shifts that are happening in that direction, but a lot of times women feel the stress and pressure to take that break or take that back seat at work because they've had a child, because they don't want to lose the position that they're at in their career. And a lot of them are kicking ass at their career, right? And it's unfair to expect them to take a back seat at that point, right? So I feel like a lot of companies need to create that space, because the company that creates that space, you have a really loyal employee who's going to come back to you, right? Because if a woman is seeing a company give her that kind of comfort in their organization, she's going to work harder, she's going to perform just the way she was before she's had the kid, and she will be loyal to you because you've created that space for her. And I think a lot of companies aren't seeing that value. Some of them are, but I think a lot more need to do that, because you need to sort of be able to think of people's careers from a longer term perspective. I think in today's day and age, 3-4 years is considered long. When our parents' generations, it was 20-30 years at a certain company, right? So there needs to be a middle ground somewhere, and you need to be building people's careers for the longer term, which a lot of companies aren't doing. And I think that if they're looking at somebody with a 10-year horizon, they will make that space for that person. And I think a lot of businesses need to move towards that.
Fair enough. But, and while it makes a lot of sense from a work perspective, from a personal perspective, do you have any message or advice for women who are under a lot of pressure, even the choice of motherhood for that matter? Because, and especially women who are in their early 30s and who are actually, like you said, at the peak of their career also, are suddenly faced with this pressure of making a decision because the biological clock.
Absolutely. I'm living through that right now, right? Like, I haven't had a child, and it is something I think about, and I don't know where I stand on that yet, but I'm also worried about all of these things that we've discussed. So it's a little difficult to give advice when you're kind of, in that same space. But I think for me, what I try to do is just keep reminding myself of that is what do I want to prioritize, and what's important to me, and ultimately only I can make that decision, right? So I think that's my reminder to other folks out there, is really introspect on what you want and what's important to yourself, and then base your decisions, right? Don't feel pressure to continue working if you have the comfort of being able to manage and actually take a backseat in your career for your family, if that's important to you. If having a child is not important to you, do not feel the pressures of society or your in-laws or your parents to, force you to make a decision you don't want to. And it's not easy. I think we all struggle through it, but I think really spending time with yourself to internalize what you want is my advice. I try to do that. I fail, I succeed. It kind of goes up and down, but the more you do that, the more you understand what you want, the easier things will get as you sort of progress. And I feel like I've reached a stage where I've started to understand myself a lot better than I used to. Definitely better than I did in my 20s. And I hope that continues, as time progresses.
And, I also agree that this problem is, I think, very unique to our specific generation also. Because when you look at our moms and our mother-in-laws and everything, that was a very different generation. And for them, there is no debate.
Yeah.
Right? And if you look at people who are younger to us, maybe a bit of Gen Z, Gen Y, everything that's going on. For them, they're like, no, do what you want. Why are you even thinking about it? But that internal dilemma, it's exclusive for this age.
We're the generation where you're stuck in the middle.
Yeah. We'll move on to the next segment. How did you get to Netflix? And if there are any tips for people who are aspiring to join the brand?
Yeah, I think a part of it, and I think this is a part for all global brands, because they're all pretty competitive and sought out. So whether it's Duolingo or Netflix, and I think that process is pretty similar. So I think the first is to find roles that are relevant to your experience. And again, you need to know this, right? You need to be able to really see if your skill set matches that role. And a lot of times people blindly apply. Like, it's just like, I'm going to take a shot at this and I'm going to apply. And the funny part is that's, and being on both sides of the table, both from a hiring perspective as well as from a applying perspective, you don't realize what's happening on the other side, right? And I think if you understand that a little bit, you will be a little more selective with your applications, because what happens is, especially in a market like India, and especially for these global, highly sought after roles, everyone blindly applies. So you just get such a volume of resumes that you're inundated by it. One part is being true to yourself in terms of whether you can do that immediately, right? I wanted to work at Netflix from when I was at ET, right? But I could not get the role at Netflix straight out of that job. I had to do the work to get there. What was the work that I did? I first built my creative chops, my campaign skills at an agency, which was a digital startup, a smaller agency, which I took a pay cut to join, and that's what I'm saying. Like, sometimes you have to make these decisions because you're taking a punt on yourself. And for me, that was an investment. And it truly was, because it built my foundation as a marketer. And from that job, because I've kind of built my portfolio, I put in my time and effort, I built really strong campaigns and this was a period of at least 4.5 years. That's when I got my first global opportunity, which came from Vice. And at Vice, it was kind of matching my experience set of what I had done at Supari, which was building a content platform called Vitamins 3. And the reason Vice hired me was because it was speaking about narratives that aren't covered as much. So it editorially touched on what Vice wanted to do. And it had a branded angle to it as well, which is also what Vice was trying to do with setting up Virtue and those kind of things. So I fit that role really well, which is how I got that job. From Vice, I moved to Netflix's social media team. That was my starting point. And the reason I could do that was because, one, I had worked on Curse Crime with Amazon Prime. So it showcased how I could create editorial content with an OTT platform as a project I had worked on. Plus, I had built, again, Vitamins 3, which had a social community and a big fandom around it, which matched the role at Netflix really well. And that's how that happened. And then within Netflix, I proved my experience of being able to build out a campaign. And that's how I shifted from the social team to the marketing team. So it doesn't all happen in one go. This is over a period of at least 10 years, so this is not an overnight process. And I think a lot of people are in a hurry and they assume that it will happen overnight. And they're like, oh, it's a lottery. I'll send my resume 10 times and then maybe the 10th time I'll get lucky, right? It's not how it works. You have to do the work first. And I don't mean that, this is what I mean. And I give people this advice a lot, is that sometimes you might need a transitional job to get to your dream job. And then when you get there, your dream job might not actually be your dream, right? And again, that's what happened to me, because I really enjoyed my time at Netflix. I enjoyed the work that I did. Yeah, and like I said, sometimes you assume that what's your dream company is actually not. And I don't mean it in a way that I didn't enjoy my time at Netflix. I think it was great and it really helped me build my career and I did some of my favorite work there. But I got a really great opportunity at Duolingo, and that was to lead the marketing efforts for the Duolingo English Test. It was building the market scope. It had, it was a really interesting disruptor product because it's really taking on traditional testing brands. And I found that opportunity really exciting because I think it was marrying the scrappiness of the startup life that I've worked at in the past, as well as having a big global agency being a part of it. And I think that combination was really exciting, and I've really enjoyed my time at this role. And I think this is a place that I could grow and expand my horizons as well. And I think that's the part that becomes a bit challenging, right? Is what you think is what you want might not actually be. And this ties back to our earlier conversation as well about life. It's not just about your career, And I think a lot of people put so much value on having that big brand name, but you actually could have a really meaningful career doing something completely different that equally satisfies you, pays you well, gives you work-life balance. And people need to sort of open their minds to those kind of roles as well.
Fair enough. So actually this brings me to my next question. In terms of marketing, in terms of campaigns, what's happening in Duolingo? Anything that we can expect in the new year?
Yeah, a lot actually. I think that's the space is that when you're a small team, there's always a lot going on. But along with that, you also need to prioritize a lot, right? And there's finite amount of things that you can do. What we've been doing in the last year or so is really prioritizing American universities and that narrative of the fact that you see a really high volume of Indian students seeking to study abroad and study in the US. So we're actually creating a lot of focused campaigns around that. AP Telangana is a very important market for us because you see a very large volume of STEM aspirants traveling to the US. That's the highest volume of US graduates from India. Besides that, I think there's very interesting familiarity between Duolingo, which is the language app, as well as the DET, which is the Duolingo English Test. And what we're trying to do is see what the overlap is between both products, because we want to leverage some of the brand love that Duolingo has, but we also don't want to risk diluting the trust and the credibility of the DET, because that's a slightly more serious product, a slightly more high stakes product in those senses. But I think Duolingo's built a lot of credibility about being a massive edtech player from a language learning perspective, and there's definitely spaces for us to explore. So we're also brainstorming on ways that we can bring the brands closer together. So if you see our DT's social media, you'll actually see Duo, the mascot, being quite active and quite prominent on our social pages. So that's just some of the stuff that we're working on currently.
To wrap up this segment, I have one last question. What is the hardest decision you've had to take as a marketer?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what to prioritize, because it might not sound like the most difficult decision, but when you're actually a really lean team in the market and a market the size of India, figuring that out is actually super hard, because there's so much opportunity. There's so many places you can be active, you can be running campaigns, you can be spending your money, and your budget is finite, right? So you really need to pick what those one or two big bets are, and you need to be convinced that those are the right bets. And that's the hard part, right? Because you're taking a punt on something, you're leaning in one direction, and being able to really have conviction as to why that's the right pick and not get distracted and run after the next shiny thing, I think is the challenge. And yeah, I've found that super hard in this last year, because this is a job where I've really had to refine what my market priorities are, who my audience is, really sharpen my marketing chops, and I've enjoyed it so far. I think it's been an exciting journey.
So yeah, this is the last part. It's just like a fun game where we try to channelize our inner Karan Johar and
Rapid fire. Ready for it.
okay, perfect. So actually we call this segment, we've named it after the guest. So the segment is called Who is Tara Kapur? Okay. And so my first question is, who is Tara Kapur when not working?
A goofball. I think my husband will validate that, but yeah.
It's cool. Okay, one place you go to get away from everything.
Landour. So I love going back to where my school is and spending time there. This is actually a picture of that spot, which reminds me of it every day. So that's my go-to place.
That's so nice. One food you absolutely love and why?
Sushi. I love any Japanese food, and sushi is my go-to, and it's yum.
And your go-to healthy snack?
I wish I was healthier with my snacking. I'm not. Right now it's fruit. So we always have some fruit in our fridge, and that's my go-to currently. But that's only been since the beginning of Jan, so I've not been very committed to healthy snacking, which I should be.
Which actually brings me to the next question, your guilty pleasure.
Guilty Diet Coke.
I share it. Okay. One book you're reading right now.
I'm right now reading a book called Expatriates, which I've just started, so not necessarily the one I can really talk about, but just finished Lessons in Chemistry as well, which is a great book. Really enjoyed it.
One show or movie you're streaming right now.
Just finished The Reacher on Amazon Prime, which is probably one of the few genres of content that me and my husband can agree to watch over dinner. And since we're doing rapid fire, I also finished watching all of Coffee with Karan recently.
Yeah, that one has to be there. One talent you wished you had.
I wish I was more like, actually no, what I really wish I had as a talent was singing, because I am a terrible singer, but I would love to be more musically inclined. Random talent, but I would love it.
I get that. And who would you be if not a marketer?
I'd like to say an athlete, but that would highly unrealistic. But yeah, I mean something I'm passionate about. But like I said, I doubt it would have happened. I would have probably been a failed athlete.
You never know. Good, perfect. So yeah, I think this was it from our end. Thank you so much for joining in Human Behind the Marketer episode after episode. Please do continue to support us and drop in comments about what do you think about all the debates we had.